Welcome to Cancer and Peace. My name is Stewart, and I'm going to be facilitating a conversation with my good friend, Peter Scalzo. Peter's been on his 18-year cancer journey, and we're going to talk about a topic that we've talked about in a different, that was only a voice only, and we wanted to put a different character around this today and dive in a bit. And the topic, we're going to call it Joseph's journey. Mm-hmm. And I think it's just a great example in the Bible of somebody who has gone through great trials and the purpose of that.
Yeah, and I think we've always said, or we've always maintained that that purpose is an important component of really living in a meaningful way in a cancer journey. So this is a great story about purpose and kind of answers the why question, that sort of thing. So I think it's a wonderful story. It's in fact the what the character gets to, the point that he gets to, is a place that's been very helpful for me in my cancer journey. So why don't you launch it?
I will launch it, and I'm going to give credit to our good buddy Greg Dietrich, who has done quite a few messages on this. It's kind of like a specialty of his for a while, and it really stuck deep with me. And so first we want to reference that some of these points were from him, and I think as we talk about this a little bit, it's such a great story. It starts out, it's early in the Bible, but Joseph was a son of, he's one of the sons of Israel, as God redefined his name. And Joseph was one of the favored sons. At the time, he was the favored son. And as a favored son, he was given gifts from his father that made his brothers really jealous. The coat of many colors is the thing that comes to mind the biggest. And it appears from the text that Joseph flaunted these gifts a bit, and that he kind of was a little bit, he waved these in front of his brother's face quite a bit, and everybody in the family knew that he was the favored son. Mm-hmm. So his family of origin story starts from a place of what I would call family brokenness. And
how many brothers did Joseph have?
Well, I guess he had 10 plus. Then he had his younger brother himself. So
Benjamin,
which was his younger brother.
Yeah.
And so, and that's how you get to the 12 tribes of Israel, as these 12 boys.
So in other words, his dad had chosen, because the character is really focuses kind of on the father, right, and Joseph. And so Joseph had a few dreams that he related to his brothers. And then his dad, of course, had given him a gift which set him apart, really. And it's this technicolored, multicolored coat that, there's Joseph, and the technicolored coat is a famous like musical or play or whatever, right? So that's part of this story.
And the dreams were dreams that were basically his brothers bowing down to him, his brothers, and even his dad. And so it didn't play well even with his dad that he shared this dream with them. And so they only became more angry with this.
I just wonder too how he actually delivered it to them. Like, yeah, I had this dream, or, hey, it's puzzling to me, but I had this dream. I don't even know if there's a good way to actually deliver that one.
When we were growing up and we got something over our sibling, I know how I would have, and it wasn't going to be, I'm really puzzled at the situation I had because it just doesn't seem right to me.
Yeah.
And I was like, dude,
listen to this.
Check this out.
Yeah.
You will bow.
Yeah.
And so, and that precipitated into great family strife. And so you see, and I think anytime you see this kind of favoritism from a father, this is the family brokenness that I'm saying is exhibited. Yeah. And this is a family of origin. All of us grew up in family of origins that have brokenness. And this family had its own set of brokenness. And the reason why you talked about purpose is that God did have a purpose for Joseph's life, but he was starting with a story that wasn't a healthy one. It was a story of a family of brokenness and jealousy, envy, and that turned into a point where his brothers were, at least a good chunk of them, were willing to kill him.
Yeah, I mean, like resentment, bitterness, into hatred.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a journey that a lot of us are on.
To get to a point where you're willing to kill one of your siblings because there's so much resentment, bitterness, anger.
Yes.
That tells you the level of brokenness that was
Yes.
happening in this family.
Hmm.
And it's so weird that this is the chosen people, right? God
Yeah.
chose
Yeah.
this broken, messed up family
Yeah.
as the family that he was going to bless to
And
eventually bring.
I think that's the beauty not only of this story, but all of Scripture is that humanity is on full display in all its brokenness.
So if you can relate to any level of brokenness in your life, you're going to be able to relate to Joseph's story
Hmm.
and the story of this family of brokenness. And it has such a interesting turn. There's as the brothers are out shepherding, basically watching the flocks. He asks Joseph to go out and check up on them, and they see him coming from a long ways away, and they start plotting.
Was he
And
bringing them something, or I forget, but the story, but I forget if he was bringing them some food or something like that. But anyway, he went to see his brothers. They're out in the wilderness somewhere. So they're not near their father. They're away from their family, from the parents.
yes, and their plan was to kill him eventually, but then
Oh,
the one of the brothers is like, "Hey, maybe just as things were happening, a caravan was coming along of
yeah,
slave traders,
yeah,
basically at the time, and it's like, hey, maybe rather than killing him and having this blood on this, we could just sell him into slavery,
yep.
and that would we won't have his blood on us, and then
The interesting thing is, I remember it was the oldest that argued,
yes,
"Let's spare his life." Yeah,
yes.
yeah, Reuben. Yeah,
And so, in doing so, the other brothers finally agreed to do that. But then they took his coat that was the gift that set him apart, and they dipped it in blood and shredded it up and told Dad that he was attacked by a wild animal and
mm,
killed. And so his father began to grieve in
mm,
that moment.
hmm,
And but when they first caught him, they threw him into a pit. And as they were plotting on what to do with him, that's when the slave traders came along and they made this choice to sell him into slavery. So Joseph starts out in a broken family as the chosen one in this broken family, and his first journey that God sends him on is to the pit. So he's basically in this deep pit, and
Now, why would you say God?
well, look at that.
We're gonna find out, right?
Yeah, I think this is a point that we wanted to really highlight on, and I think the reason why this story is such a great story in the Bible is because we wanted to talk a little bit about suffering and that suffering has a purpose. And if you look at Joseph coming from his starting point of a broken family and what sounds like prideful, arrogant, and bragging and lacking discernment in areas of his life, God brings him on a journey to something that he wanted him to grow into, his destiny, his purpose, his real purpose. But his purpose needed to have a lot of growth before he was ready to walk into that purpose. And the starting point of that was the pit. And so I don't think it's a coincidence, and I think the Bible makes it pretty clear it wasn't a coincidence that he was put into a pit and slave traders came along at just at that time for him to take the next step in his journey.
Mm.
And I think that's what
Yeah.
happens to all of us in suffering is there's
Hmm.
something symbolic here is that the pit represents a starting point of suffering in our lives.
Yeah, and I think I was just thinking about St. John of the Cross and going through the dark night of the soul, which is a pit for sure. And his point was that God is purging us of things, and he talks about the seven deadly sins, but like pride is one and that kind of thing, but that God has a purpose in
Mm.
that, in the dark night of the soul.
So take some time to reflect what your pit might be.
Mm.
I know we've done a mini podcast, some sharing of different walls or pits, and you referenced John of the Cross. That's where this term, the wall and the dark night of the soul,
Mm.
is really in a lot of modern discussions are still referring back to St. John of the Cross and his journey of great suffering in which he wrote the dark night of the soul. And I think that's such a great, his story is literally being locked into something the size of a closet, and he is basically defecating on himself, and he's
Yeah, I
gets very
remember.
little
Yeah.
food, and they take him out and they beat him on a regular basis.
Hmm.
And in this time of great suffering and hardship in his own pit, he connects deeply to being able to hear God and see God and know God in a deeper way.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder about Joseph. He is favored by his dad, given this coat, has these dreams, and thinks, okay, I'm favored by God too. And yet he goes to visit his brothers and they throw him in the pit. They
Yeah.
actually want to kill him, really, but instead they spare his life.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because what you
Yeah.
just said is that he thought he was favored by God too. And I think that's interesting. I
Yeah.
think he recognized the dreams. And if you've had dreams in your life, sometimes you wake up from a crazy dream and it's like, oh, that was a crazy dream. But for a lot of us, and I'm going to guess there's lots of our listeners here, you've had a dream and you know that it's a dream with a meaning.
Mm.
That dream had some purpose. It was a little bit different, and it was something about the feeling and the way it came about. And I've had a few of those in my life. And
Mm-hmm.
Joseph describes in the Bible this dream and recurring and having dreams with a purpose.
Right.
And so I think he thought he was favored by God,
Yeah.
and in some sense he was. And that's why when you say, "Hey, he was thrown into a pit," that God threw him into a pit. It's really fascinating. And you said a quote earlier,
Yeah.
and I'm going to throw it back at you. And it was something along the lines of, well, I'll just let you, hopefully not to put you on the spot too much,
It's okay.
but our greatest suffering. Yeah.
What's that?
It was about our greatest sufferings. That sometimes our greatest sufferings are where God's doing his greatest work. I think is that kind of an idea.
Right. Right. Do you want to talk about that now, or?
Yeah. If you put it out there, we'll just tie in because that's the starting point. Because I think the pit is the starting point of Joseph's suffering.
Yeah.
And you challenged me, hey, was that God?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, yeah. So I think sort of what this story is going to come to a very important point.
Yeah,
That's really been helpful for me in my life. But it's this. I imagine Joseph in this pit thinking, what is going on? God, where are you? I had these dreams. Dad, where are you? Where's my help? And this is my own family that wants to kill me.
Family selling me out.
Yeah, so these are my brothers throwing me into this pit. And then finally selling him to a caravan that's heading to Egypt as a slave. It's like, brothers, you just sent me into a life of really pain, suffering, slavery. And you guys sent me here. And so I could see how Joseph would be like, God doesn't have any role in this at all. And yet, we're going to find out that he has more suffering to go through, Joseph. But we're going to find out that God uses suffering in our lives to do what he wants to accomplish. And I mentioned Johnny Erickson Tada before when we were just about to do this. And Johnny Erickson Tada was paralyzed from a diving accident when she was 16. She's still alive today. She's actually a cancer survivor, but she's wheelchair bound since then. And she's in her 60s now. But she says that God will allow what he hates to accomplish what he loves. And it's this concept of, I was looking in Isaiah. It happens to be Christmas time right now, and there's the suffering servant passage, and it's Isaiah foretelling, prophesying of what's going to happen when the root of Jesse comes on the scene. He's really talking about Jesus, but I don't know if he knew that, but it's so many years before Jesus came on the scene. But the passage goes on to say that it was God's good plan to crush his son. And it's like, hold on.
What?
Yeah, does that make sense? Loving God.
You put the wrong word in there, right?
Yeah.
Not crush, yes.
Yeah, that's what
amazing, yeah.
That's what the text says. God's good plan. And it's like, well, how could it? And so I had a meeting with the cancer support group, and I was talking about how could it ever be God's good plan to crush me? Like what?
That's what we're exploring today.
Yes. And I think as a cancer patient, or even as a human being, what wonderful truths come out of this journey about theology, about God and how he interacts with us as people.
Yeah. No, I think that's really good because as you move on in this story, you see that this person's being crushed. As you said, it's like you're in a time of great despair, so close to losing their life, but instead losing, in a sense, their life. They were sold into slavery, which is a very horrible life, slavery in Egypt. And so that happens. And so he moves to this place. We're going to call it Potiphar's house. And this is Greg's term. He uses three P's. The
Yeah.
pit and Potiphar's house is the second round. And Potiphar is a Egyptian official who basically ends up buying Joseph out of this slave caravan. And Joseph is put to work. And in that space, I love something that that Greg talked about, and I really hadn't thought about this way, and I really thought it was a great concept, is that God had a purpose for Joseph, but he needed Joseph to understand the customs of Egypt, the how trading and household life worked in Egypt for him to accomplish his long-term purpose. And we always think about great learning coming from universities or something like this. But God had something much better than a university for Joseph. He had slavery in an Egyptian official's house for him to learn how the financial markets, how trading happened, how households operated, what were the customs in Egypt of how people did life on an everyday basis. And in that, he learned how to be diligent with the wealth of his master.
And we should say that Potiphar recognized the giftings of Joseph. Joseph was a very gifted person. He saw that Joseph could manage his household, because I think the text says something like all Potiphar cared about what he was going to eat that day. Like Joseph was taking care of every detail in this high-ranking official's house, right?
As Joseph grew in his skills, knowledge, understanding with his gifting, everything was turned over to him. And so it shows you that he developed a competency in the university of Potiphar's house, slave. And this is such an important thing, because we don't think about, our hardship as educating us so much of the time. But that's, if we start looking at this story, and then we can start looking at our own story, and we'll find that most of the time our greatest learnings come during our great hardships. And so cancer being one of those. And cancer plus, there's likely somebody who's on a cancer journey. Your story is a great story, is that you were going through marriage difficulties and a cancer journey at the exact same time. And those hardships were growing something in you. And that's exactly what was happening with Joseph in this story, is that he was learning how to live and manage at a high level with a high-ranking official for the Egyptian government. And so Potiphar's house became the university that was the great teacher for him. And something happened in there. He also learned integrity. He wasn't, while he had great favor, he was also, in that same case, he was all along the way. There's a theme here. And the first theme was he was basically betrayed by his brothers. And the next one is he's betrayed by Potiphar's wife, who tries to seduce him, and he runs from her. And so she creates a lie about him. And that gets him thrown in prison.
That's like another coat story. She grabs his cloak, right? Or something, so she can prove he was. There's a lot of coats going on with Joseph.
There's interesting things, though. There's a theme of betrayal that's happening. And that's something that to think about, is like as the themes that are happening in our lives as we're going through difficulty. So from the pit to Potiphar's house, he's betrayed, but he's gained the learnings that he needed to.
What's interesting is also, sorry to interrupt, Sean, but just our propensity to blame. Like, I just wonder if he was like, those brothers of mine, they ruined my life, or that Potiphar's wife, she ruined my life. And yet God was moving underneath it all. Which we're going to say.
Yeah, I think you're talking about how was he dealing with his own emotions and feelings and bitterness along the way. And I think that's the thing that has to be, dealt with the next leg of the journey, is that the third P is prison, is that he moves from Potiphar's house after being accused by Potiphar's wife of impropriety sexually with her. He's thrown into prison, and there he begins the final leg of his training. And God's bringing him in through his own training course that looks like devastation, the pit, slavery in Potiphar's house, and now the worst thing it could be is in prison in a foreign country, someone with no value, and he begins his time there. And there he learns how to navigate this great suffering and difficulty in such a way that they begin to turn over even the jail operations to him, because
Mhm.
his gifting, rather than slumping and going, it's over. He's diligent.
And I'm sure he had those times.
Yeah.
I mean, I heard 13 years. He was 13 years there
Yeah.
in prison. I'm sure he had the times of like, what's life all about? What's happening? What is this?
Yeah.
Like total like hopelessness and doubt and all that. I'm sure he had times of that, right?
I know he did.
Yeah.
But we do see examples of him. What he did do is he built
Hmm.
relationships.
Yeah. Oh, that's
While he
good.
was there, he connected with the people that were also there. And so we see examples of that with the fact that he was given charge over many of the other inmates that are there.
Hmm.
But we also see two key examples was the cupbearer and the baker were both there, and he had interactions and conversations with them. And he asked them, "Hey, remember me?"
Well, and more to your dreams thing, he was interpreting dreams, right?
And he was
And
interpreting
that's
people's
actually
dreams.
what got him out of prison to see Pharaoh in the end, right? Pharaoh kept having a dream.
Yeah.
So what you were saying about dreams.
Well, the thing about dreams is interesting is that he didn't let go of hope.
Right.
Is that something about what God had shown him before gave him great hope? And I think this is an
Hmm.
important thing to stop at this point. Is and we've talked quite a bit about hope and hopelessness. And as you're going through these difficult times, you have to consciously choose to look back at
Hmm.
what is, where does my value come from, and what has God spoken into my life. And so to survive the pit in Potiphar's house in prison, there had to be a deep hope and a belief in
Hmm.
something that was
Yeah.
greater than himself.
Yeah. Yeah. I think for me, it's there's some people in the cancer support group that I co-lead that have been on long cancer journeys, but for me, it's so many times I've been like, Lord, when is this going to end? Because 18 years and like a number of recurrences and a number of surgeries. Even now, I just had a procedure last month and infusion last month. I have to see my surgeon tomorrow. But it's like, it just is like this place where it just continues and continues. So
Mhm.
hope is a huge,
That's so big. Yeah.
yeah, part of that. Yeah.
I was having this conversation in a different way about we had one of our ministry partners here for our larger disability event that we had, and we got a chance to catch up for 2 or 3 hours the other night. And he was asking me, "Hey, how are things going? What's going on with the mission?" And I was sharing with him everything that was going on, and in our current hardships even. And he's like, "Well, how do you go forward with with that level of uncertainty?"
Mm.
And I was like, "Well, I think it's the very same thing." I didn't say this part, but as I'm reflecting on it, it's what happened with Joseph was that he saw God's faithfulness, and he knew there was hope in something that was bigger than him.
Hmm.
And, and I think about, we learn from our history with God.
Hmm.
And if we don't learn that, we know the next step is going to be, we didn't, like Joseph didn't know if there was a fourth P from prison,
Yeah, that's true.
what I'm saying?
Yeah.
He didn't know, and
Yeah.
neither do I. But God's doing something and bringing us somewhere. And our hope isn't in whether it's a fourth P or whether it's going to be,
Right.
which might be paradise. I don't know, something
Yeah.
we don't have. I mean, I guess in one sense we have a hope of our long term future with that that God is going to make all things right, and so
Hmm.
we have that hope. But I think in our current, like as we're walking our everyday life, there's this: how do I surrender to uncertainty next?
Right.
And
Right.
it's really trusting that God has our best, and
Hmm.
that even if the next step is another step of hardship,
Hmm.
it's because he has our best. And so that was the reflection I was having on it. But I remembered my memory of God's faithfulness to the mission and to the things that he was doing, and how he's provided over and over, and how people have come and gone and things have happened, but God's always had his hand right there
Yeah.
in the midst of that. And so it's not trusting in a certain future of what the next thing is. There a third or a fourth P? Is there going to be a prison or a Potiphar's house or a pit? But that he's in it for my best, for the mission's best, for all who are connected here's best. That I can relax into. That's a great hope. And I think that's what Joseph got to. And God was confirming that along the way with these dreams, because he had interpreted apparently many dreams correctly of people who were there in the prison, and which he did the same thing with the baker and the cupbearer. And it didn't turn out so good for one of them, because one of the dreams was, hey, your head's going to be taken off. And it happened just as he said. And the other one said, you're going to be promoted. But he said, when it happens, will you remember me? And he didn't. And that's the third betrayal. Like, we had these big betrayals, and these people who he had helped along the way, or who should have been the people that protected him the most, betrayed him every step of the way. And so I wonder, as I look at this story, how much the scars had to be from betrayal, the scar of betrayal, over and over and over again in his life, and how to overcome that would have been a difficult journey.
And I think people, we in a cancer journey can feel that God is betraying us. I mean, that might be a theme for some people, you know.
If we think about where Joseph started, what it sounds like a prideful, arrogant, overly favored son who flaunted it, to betrayal over and over. He had to develop a trust and a hope. And God shaped something in that that moved him to what I think might have been what we describe now as poverty of spirit.
I mean, it had to humble him for sure. Yeah, I think poverty of spirit would be the right way to say it. And Jesus saying in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Yeah.
So there's a punchline to this story. I think it's something that we really wanted to work towards here, is that eventually, the Pharaoh has a dream himself, and nobody can interpret it. And then the cupbearer says, hey, I do remember this guy in prison who was pretty good at this. Maybe he can do it. And sure enough, he does. And Pharaoh gives Joseph the opportunity, and Joseph basically tells him what the dream was. And he also gives him the interpretation that there were going to be 7 years of great fatting, great crops. Everything's going to be wonderful. And then 7 years of great famine. And Pharaoh knew that this was the true interpretation of his dream. And he asked Joseph to be second in command of all of Egypt, so that he could save the country, the land, the people. And that's exactly what happens. As Joseph becomes second in command, he manages the 7 years really well, of great crops. And then when the famine comes, the nation is prepared. And this is such a great story, because God's using all the things that he's learned through the pit and through Potiphar's house and even prison, was the university that Joseph needed to be second in command of Egypt, to be able to manage well this nation who was going to face great hardship. And in that great hardship, his brothers were also experiencing that famine, and yet they didn't have the foreknowledge that Joseph had with this dream, and they came begging for food. And they came into Joseph's court begging for food.
And they didn't recognize him.
They didn't recognize him. And why would they? He's no way that this person, they had sold him into slavery, was now the second in command of this great land, who had managed well in famine. And the big question is like, how does Joseph deal with betrayal? He's been betrayed over and over. And the ones who started that great betrayal, the ones who he should expect to protect him the most, his own family, were in his court. And we see that God, in this time in Potiphar's house and in prison, had reshaped Joseph's heart. He didn't act out in bitterness.
He doesn't reveal who he is to them right away. And he plays a few little games with them so he can see Benjamin and that sort of thing. But when it came down to
He tests them.
Yeah, he tests them.
He finds out where they're at. He tests them.
Yeah.
And the tests were appropriate tests to see how would they respond, and were they the same people, and where were they at in their own journeys, because it's been a long time. And ultimately, Joseph is able to save his own family, the one that betrayed him. He's able to save them, and ultimately his family is reunited. His dad finds out he's actually alive and that he's ruling Egypt, and ultimately the family gets moved to Egypt so that they are able to be saved from the famine and to grow.
So they're living basically as Joseph's neighbors. Then the father dies, passes, and the brothers are like, "Oh no, we don't have that buffer anymore. Joseph is going to come after us, right?"
The reason why he hasn't killed us is because he didn't want to upset Dad, and that's where the story gets really interesting.
Yeah,
because after Dad dies, the brothers basically start trying to figure out, hey, how do we deal with this? Because if he's coming after us, we have no hope because we betrayed him in such a big way. And Joseph, rather than taking it out of them, he finds out, because they come to him and it's like, hey, we will serve you, we'll be your slaves, we'll do all those things. And he was like
bowing down to him.
Yeah. And one of the most amazing passages in all of the Bible, and it's in Genesis 50. And Joseph says to them, hey, I have no intention of lashing out at you. What you meant for evil, God meant for good.
Yeah.
Such an amazing passage. This thing that, this suffering that they had poured out on their brother, this unspeakable act of selling him into slavery for great suffering, while they meant it for evil, God meant the very same act for good.
Yeah.
And so as you or I or all of us sit here and we look at our suffering in our lives, while God doesn't mean us to see and feel great evil, this is coming from a different place.
Yeah.
God means to use that very tool of suffering for great good.
Yeah, and this is where I like to use the tapestry illustration when I'm talking about this concept, because it's a mystery, right? How does God work with the free will of us, work with an enemy that wants to destroy us, work with the brokenness of this world, and yet weave something in our lives that's for our good? And because a tapestry, if you look underneath it, it looks chaos. It looks like chaos. Threads are going everywhere. But when you turn it over, it's a beautiful picture. And that's, I use that when I'm speaking about my cancer journey to illustrate that even if I'm looking at chaos, can I be in a place of trust that God is meaning all this for good, for my good, and even beyond me, the people around me, for their good too.
I think that's the message of this for today is as I look at your life, I look at my own life, but as a cancer podcast, I'm looking at your life and I see the great suffering, that it's been a long period of suffering. And I see this great good that God's brought out of that you are a transformed life, and you're sharing that journey with everyone that is close by, and that there's great peace when you can embrace that suffering for the good that's in it, not because we're masochists who are saying suffering, we want suffering. It's knowing that, and I think there's great peace in knowing that in suffering, exactly as Johnny Erickson Tada had said, that God's doing an incredible work, and he's bringing inside of you something that is more amazing than you could ever imagine. And he has your very best.
And my assumption with Joseph, let's picture him on a balcony overlooking Egypt and he looks Egyptian. He has an Egyptian wife, but that he thinks back and reflects back on what happened and on how has served. And it's not a matter of pride for him, I wouldn't think. It's not an egomaniac kind of thing. It's a, wow, God, look what you've done in me and through me. And I think that's how I feel, that God is strongest in me when I'm weak. And look what he's done in me and through me. And you too, because you've been thrust into a position, even running this mission, which has been very difficult. And you're not standing in pride saying, look at what I'm doing. You're saying, look at what God's doing in me and through me, right?
I think there's something really great and peaceful when you recognize that it's our brokenness that is bringing the greatest transformation in our lives. And so I've seen that in us. It's brought the most transformation in our mission as we individually, as missionaries and people here who are working in ministry, embrace our weakness and our brokenness. God's using that as his very tool to transform our lives and what it means to do ministry to others. And I see that with Cancer and Peace here, that God's using your suffering to help and to reach others in their time of suffering. And I think everybody who's listening to this podcast, who's walking in a cancer journey, you're being called into something bigger, greater than you can even ever imagine. And that's the reason why the suffering is great, is because the mission is even greater than that. And there's great peace and hope in that. And that's the message that we wanted to leave you with today, is that God has such great purpose for each of our lives. And it comes many times in great suffering. And that is, but it's worth the journey. And you see it just played out in this Joseph journey. We don't always understand. You see in Job's story, we don't always understand that purpose, but let's lean into it and trust God with it, and you'll find great peace.
Amen. Thank you.
So that's a wrap for today. I hope you enjoyed just listening to us riff a little bit on Joseph's journey. And we thank you for just being a part of this podcast.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.